CBC News Final. Make it your news tonight at 11.
And Brent Bambury.
Hi there, this is Midday for Wednesday, September 27th.
On the show today, Lou Barbaria investigated the criminal activities of American biker gangs. This week he's passing on his expertise to his Canadian colleagues. We'll go to Quebec City for that story.
Taslima Nasreen has been called the female Salman Rushdie. She writes about the persecution of Bangladeshi women, and some Islamic fundamentalists want her to pay with her life. She joins us in studio.
Paul Martin had some strong words for Quebec yesterday if the province decides to go its own way. Our business panel has details.
And we'll talk to Jane Sibrey about her long-awaited new album, Maria. First, here's Noel Richardson with the Midday News.
Good day from the National Newsroom. Thousands of people in Toronto rushed the provincial legislature today. It's the day the new Ontario government delivers its throne speech. The demonstrators demanded that the government stop cutting social services, but Premier Mike Harris has said he will continue to reduce government spending. The protesters forced their way past barricades the police had set up, then they rushed the doors of the legislature, but police managed to stop them there.
We want Harris! 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 We want Harris!
It's about to get tougher for Mike Harris. For almost 100 days, his Conservatives have ruled Ontario without calling the legislature into session, leaving the opposition parties without their main weapon, question period.
During the session, we intend to pursue a very ambitious legislative agenda.
During a summer of cuts, the Conservatives have already stopped construction of a subway line, halted work on hundreds of non-profit housing projects, eliminated funding for 14,000 daycare spaces, and within days, hundreds of thousands of people on welfare will have their benefits reduced by more than 20%. In the coming months, health care cuts are expected. At least 13,000 public sector jobs are to be eliminated. And workfare, mandatory work for welfare, has been promised.
I'm saddened. I'm also angry.
The former Premier, Bob Rae, says the Conservatives are going faster and further than anyone expected.
It's mean-spirited. They promised they wouldn't hurt the disabled, they wouldn't hurt the vulnerable, and I'm afraid that's exactly what we're seeing.
But Harris says spending must be reduced to protect social programs and create jobs.
I think the cruelest thing one could do is to do nothing. I think that would be cruel.
Ontario's labor movement is preparing to fight. The NDP government banned the use of replacement workers during strikes. The Conservatives have promised to change that law within weeks.
We never had to deal with this before. We always argued with degrees. Now this is wholesale slaughter.
The return of the legislature gives all the government's opponents a focus. Families on welfare have already started a vigil. But the Conservatives have vowed protests, inside or out of the legislature, will not divert them from their agenda. Havard Gould, CBC News, Toronto.
The Sovereignist team in the Quebec referendum made it official today. They announced that Premier Jacques Parizeau will lead the Yes forces into battle. Members of the Yes team met with Quebec's electoral officer this morning in Quebec City. The province's referendum legislation requires both sides to officially name a leader for the campaign. The prosecution in the O.J. Simpson murder trial has resumed its closing arguments, and prosecutor Christopher Darden picked up where he left off last evening by painting Simpson as a violent and jealous man who snapped.
For some reason, in his mind, she has done something that he can't ignore, something that has set him off. He's jealous, he's raging, he's out of control, and he's in that Bronco, and he is driving as fast as he can toward Nicole's house. And it's about 10 o'clock. He is out of control, folks.
He also replayed for the jury the 911 call Nicole Brown Simpson made, in which O.J. Simpson can be heard yelling in the background.
911 emergency. Can you get someone over here now to 325 Green? He's back. Please. Okay, what does he look like? He's O.J. Simpson. I think you know his record. Is he inside right now? Okay, just a moment.
The prosecution is expected to wrap up its closing arguments later today. The judge who heads the public inquiry into the so-called Somalia affair says he could recommend criminal charges. Justice Gilles Letourneau is investigating the torture and murder of a Somali teenager by Canadian soldiers in 1993. Letourneau says some senior military officials could find themselves in court if the inquiry uncovers evidence of a cover-up.
The evidence would have to be to establish beyond reasonable doubt that there was a cover-up and that John Doe was involved in the cover-up. And if it were that conclusive, of course, we might have to say that.
Aviation investigators in the United States are performing some daring tests high above New Jersey. They're trying to figure out why a U.S. airjet suddenly went into a tailspin and plunged into a ravine last September. All 132 people on board were killed. Now, after a year of searching, investigators think they may have a clue as to why it happened. Robert Hager of NBC News reports.
First into the air, a 727, outfitted with smoke generators on its wings to mark the wake it would generate. Shortly behind, a 737 leased from U.S. Air, the same model as the plane that crashed near Pittsburgh last year after possibly hitting wake turbulence. The pictures of what happened next in the test were taken from a third plane. And what they seem to suggest is that the big 737 was knocked around dramatically by the wake left by the first plane and marked by the twin trails of smoke. In this case, the pilots of the 737 were able to control their craft easily because they knew what was coming and could see the wake before they hit it. As a precaution, the test took place at 18,000 feet, leaving room to recover if there had been any problem. But what investigators will look for as the testing goes on is whether such a wake could have been more of a problem for the pilots of the plane in the accident, since they did not know it was coming.
The test will continue for at least a week, during which investigators hope to not only learn more about the Pittsburgh crash, but also more about whatever threat wake turbulence may or may not pose to all big planes. Robert Hager, NBC News, Atlantic City, New Jersey.
At least 70 workers trapped in a coal mine in eastern India have drowned. It happened when a river in Bihar state burst its banks and poured into a mine shaft. The chief minister for Bihar is demanding an investigation into the disaster by the Federal Coal Office. Researchers in the United States believe they may have found an answer to the mystery of chronic fatigue syndrome. A new study says the disease, known as the yuppie flu, could be linked to problems with low blood pressure, and the scientists believe it could be treated with drugs and a high salt diet. The research was done at Johns Hopkins University. It appears in today's Journal of the American Medical Association. Bell Canada subscribers in Ontario and Quebec started paying more today for directory assistance. The price for help on both local and long-distance numbers is now 75 cents, up from 50 cents. Canada's telecommunications watchdog, the CRTC, approved the increase in July, but the Commission's approval isn't final yet. It still has to consider several submissions, one of them from anti-poverty groups who oppose the rate hike. A special panel today gave the federal government its plans to build Canada's information highway. It would link computers in homes, businesses, government, and other institutions. The Information Highway Advisory Council has made more than 300 recommendations in its report. Ron Charles has more.
The possibilities of the information highway are already familiar to many Canadians. Automated teller machines are in use across the country. There's interactive TV, shopping by computer, and face-to-face meetings held over teleconferencing networks. The information highway promises to link services such as these and more into one giant network. And today, the Advisory Council released its report telling the government how this should happen.
Monsieur Manley. The information highway is not just about technology. Ultimately, it is about people.
The Council's 250-page report recommends, among other things, that the driving force behind the highway should be fair competition. But at the same time, all Canadians should have access to it, no matter where they live or how much they make. And it must promote Canadian culture. The Council believes these recommendations can work even if the highway is developed by private enterprise.
There may not be a sufficient motivation for the market to provide essential services, and that's where we think that the CRTC and the government have to have some policies in place in order to ensure that Canadians across the land can take part in this revolution.
The report does have its critics. One council member questioned how Canadian jobs can be protected in an automated society. 29 people from various interest groups took part in drafting this report, but it will probably not be the last word on how Canada develops the information highway. A smaller committee will now likely look at ways the government can implement some of the report's recommendations. Ron Charles, CBC News, Ottawa.
A volcano on New Zealand's highest peak is still blasting off today. The show is going on non-stop, giving the country's North Island its most spectacular eruption in half a century. Mud, rocks, and steam are being thrown out, and ash is falling as far as 70 kilometers away. Scientists are warning that the volcano could explode in full fury at any moment. Civil defense units and the Army are on full alert. And that is the news at this hour on Wednesday, September the 27th. For CBC News, I'm Noel Richardson.
No one writes music like Jane Siberry. It's ethereal, it's unconventional, and it's absolutely compelling, and she has a brand new album out. It's called Maria. I know people are waiting for this, so today we talk to Jane Siberry.
Brent is also going to talk to Taslima Nazarene. I'm sure you've heard of her. She's a Bangladeshi writer. They call her the female Salman Rushdie. She'll be here in studio.
We'll look at the effect that Paul Martin's speech might have had on the dollar. That's the speech where he told the people in Quebec that separation is separation, and also the Japanese rogue trader who lost $1 billion for his bank.
Yeah, let's get those billions straight.
Get the zero in
First
place.
up today, though, battling the bikers.
Scenes from a funeral, a Hells Angel gang member who was shot to death 2 weeks ago in Montreal. So far, 25 people have been killed in a bloody turf war between two rival bike gangs. Police there are taking extreme measures now to counter the violence, and people are afraid.
This week in Quebec City, an international conference has been looking at ways to deal with the criminal activities of bike gangs. Lou Barbaria is a lieutenant with the New York State Police, and he was part of a special task force created to combat biker gang crime in the States. Lieutenant Barbaria, tell me what your experience was.
Well, back in the early 1980s, I happened to be assigned to a federal task force in New York City, and right about that time, 1982, the federal government started an initiative which targeted outlaw motorcycle gangs. The four top gangs in the United States were targeted: the Hells Angels, the Banditos, the Pagans, and the Outlaws. Because of the operation that I was working with in New York City, I happened to be working the Hells Angels portion of those initiatives.
And how did they work?
Well, it was a task force concept. Basically, it was headed by the federal government. The FBI was the lead agency, but we used resources from different levels of federal government, such as the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the Drug Enforcement Administration. We also utilized state and local police because of their knowledge of what was going on the street, their intelligence information, the associates of these gang members, places that they frequented, businesses that they operated. Basically, we pooled a lot of resources, a great deal of resources, which ultimately became very effective in our efforts. So
how effective were you then? Can you give me some sense of what happened?
Pardon me?
How effective was it then exactly?
Well, the particular investigation that I was involved with began, like I said, in 1982. On May 2nd, 1985, we initiated a nationwide raid operation. We hit the Hells Angels from the East Coast to the West Coast. It was a massive operation. It was more a military operation than it was a police operation, utilizing helicopters and SWAT teams, again, from coast to coast. It devastated the Hells Angels. It had a tremendously negative effect on the Hells Angels. We took out the hierarchy, especially in New York City. The #1 Hells Angel on the East Coast at the time was an individual by the name of Sandy Alexander. He was caught up in this investigation. We arrested him. We arrested many of his underlings. And it was, again, completely devastating as far as the Hells Angels were concerned. They had no idea where we were going to hit them again. It devastated them so much that I believe that they still have not recovered from that crackdown in 1985.
Wow. Now, as you know, there's some talk here about anti-gang legislation. Some people are saying this is what we need. The police are saying, you know, it's too difficult for us to get at them other ways. Did you have legislation in the states that allowed you to do that, and is that a sensible thing for us here?
We did have such legislation. We don't refer to it as anti-gang legislation. Basically, it's the Racketeering Influenced Corrupt Act. It's RICO. And it was enacted during the President Nixon administration in 1971, so it's been around a long time. And coincidentally, the first time it was utilized in the early 1970s was against the Hells Angels. And basically, it's an organizational statute. It goes after an organization. It goes after an organization that's engaged in criminal activity, and the criminal activity is funneled back into the proceeds from the criminal activity is funneled back